dal tuo computer direttamente?
Guarda, in realtà io non le ho testate sul mio computer ancora. Cioè, le ho testate ma non ho testato. Morning, benvenuti. My name is Luciano Palumbo, and I'm film restorer at the Murnau-Stiftung in Wiesbaden. Our foundation holds the rights to the majority of German film productions from early cinema to the end of the Nazi era, with some exceptions going until the 60s. The mission of the Murnau Foundation is to preserve and make accessible early German film heritage to a broad audience. With this aim, we digitize and restore films belonging to the canon of German cinema, such as Metropolis, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Nosferatu. In this framework, the Foundation recently restored the sound version of Liebing der Götter, a film directed by Hans Schwarz, starring Emil Jannings, Renate Müller, and Hans Moser, released in 1930, distributed in the US under the title Darling of the Gods. During the philological research around it, a number of clues made us believe that this film had also a silent version. The circumstances, not unique but rare at least, make this film an interesting case study in the transition from silent to sound cinema in late Wilhelmine Germany. This case made me look at the economic, technical, and stylistic issues related to the two genres that I am going to illustrate. Contrary to the United States, where the transition from silent to sound film has been softer, nominally spread on around 3 years, the German film industry of the 20s and the 30s involved itself in a sort of gold rush for the new medium, even though before its appearance, the mild demand from the audience basically did not necessarily indicate that. As soon as the first talkies were shown, the interest became quickly higher and higher. In the 30 year of production of Liebing der Götter, sound film was relentless, already disappearing. Silent film was relentless, already disappearing. So neck numbers. Of the 183 feature films shot in 1929, only 8 were sound films. In 1930, the number exploded to 101 out of 136. Out of all feature produced in 1931, only 2 were silent. Before I go on with my presentation, I think it would be useful to make clear that the phenomenon, which here I describe as a coming of sound film, has to be intended as a false truth, while sound film in Germany, more than in other countries, did already exist at least 10 years before, as the experience of the tone builder, among other, clearly shows. The difference is set from the evolution of the technical medium, since the synchronicity is now given from a new apparatus, specially designed, instead of the combination of 2 independent devices, such as a film projector and a gramophone. The appeal on the mainstream was a such success that in the 2 years period 1929-1930, many movie theaters operators were able to afford a rise of the entry price despite the economical crisis that Europe, and especially Germany, were just starting to face. Although an equally quick decrease of the number of spectators already in 1931 proves in a way that the major interest was mostly related to the new technique, namely that the coming of the talkies was not considered revolutionary at all. Germany was a special case, given from the coexistence of different elements, above all from the role of Tobis and UFA. Tobis, Tonbild Syndikat, Image Sound Syndicate, was founded as a consortium which aimed to confirm the technical asset of movie sound recording and reproduction in Germany in relation to the film production and distribution needs. A standard was identified the Klangfilm technology, a patent of the sound department of Siemens, through which the name was soon turned into Tobis Klangfilm. Tobis and its original competitor, Klangfilm GmbH, entered into a cartel agreement that divided the market between the two firms. Meanwhile, UFA and Klangfilm planned in a separate contract to develop their own sound film production. Thus, from then on, Tobis stood in direct competition with the giant UFA as a producer of film. Almost 90% of the sound features produced between 1929 and 1931 was recorded with Tobis Klangfilm, against the only 3 with General Electric and 3 Ergon, the most widely used systems outside Germany. In April 1929, were sent all around the Weimar Republic 30 movie theaters in 24 different cities equipped with Tobis apparatus. Out of the 5,071 cinemas on December 31st of the same year, the number of theaters equipped with this technique was already increased up to 233, around 4%. 1 year later, by the German premiere of Liebing de Goethe, they turned to be something like 35%. Meanwhile, an estimated big amount of theaters was updated with craftsman-made systems, adapted to already existent projectors for silent movies in order to make them Tobis compatible. The first Tobis release was Walter Ruttmann's Melodie der Welt, around 30 minutes long, while on September 30, the premiere of Carmine Gallone's Tobis production Das Land ohne Frauen, The Land Without Women, almost 2 hours long, was greeted by the press as the first feature-length German sound film. Thus it came about that, on the one end, Tobis functioned as a film production company. On the other end, together with Klangfilm, it profited doubly from the rise of sound film by offering its technology to other production companies such as UFA. The recording process was marketed under the name System Tobis Klangfilm. The playback equipment was offered under the name System Klangbild Tobis. In this manner, the Tobis Klangfilm cartel assured itself the best chances of survival during the turbulent inceptions of sound film. UFA is the acronym of Universum Film Aktiengesellschaft and marks out the name of the first German film production corporation, founded on 1917 and constantly spreading from the beginning of the 20s. UFA is the production company that based the studios in Babelsberg and produced Dr. Mabuse, Die Nibelungen, Metropolis, Frau im Mond, and eventually Varieté, Spione, Der Blaue Engel. Later on, after the beginning of the Nazi regime, was brought under state control and became de facto a monopolist until the end of the dictatorship. Despite this big success, the financial situation was unstable until 1930-31. The golden age started indeed with the talkies, when UFA took advantage from the new possibilities offered by exploiting the technical transition and its exploitabilities. Curiously, only a few years after its board, in 1927, officially voted through the motion "No interest in sound film." UFA had its own movie theater, whose amount in 1931 was 115. All new theaters were opened, already equipped with the best sound system available and very well attended. It was indeed one of the leaders in the strategy of fare reduction and still led it, even after the end of the very first wave, as all other competitors began to turn it all the way around. Meanwhile, UFA started its expansions abroad. New theaters were opened in New York and Budapest, where, among others, the premiere of Liebing de Goethe was shown, with undeclared but undeniable political aims, moved from the intention of taking the German culture among new, traditionally distrustful peoples. The goal was achieved by producing different export versions of the same title, especially by employing local actors for each market instead of dubbing or synchronize. Anyway, this was not the case of Liebing de Goethe because of different reasons. First of all, Emmy Jannings was already an international star, well known also in the United States, where he had something like a fan base among critics and publics. Similarly, he was chosen after his successes performing in Lubitsch, Murnau, and Lang's movies as the right man to be shown as face of the company in Eastern Europe, where UFA counted to conquer new markets. Secondly, because Jannings himself did not want any unnecessarily tiring competitor in the role of first man in a film that he co-produced, of which he personally chose the subject. In this scenario, it appeared quite obvious that the usual strategy in this case would not have worked. The problem was solved by making a silent version. In an exchange with Roberto della Torre from Cineteca di Milano, he referred to the term ammutolire, which I think I would translate as muted or maybe speechless, easier and economically safer to realize and sail abroad, which nevertheless, without to give up not the sound side, such as the technical innovation throughout to appeal different targets at the same time. Last but not least, the singing parts were already intended to be sold and broadcasted in German, since the two hits Ich bin ja so vergnügt and Ich singe dir ein Liebeslied were previously launched weeks before the local release of the film in order to be played in the cafes of the UFA theaters before or after other shows or screenings. Emil Jannings appeared in the first UFA-Tonwoche, UFA sound newsreel, addressing the spectators with these words. In the whole world, nothing can happen any longer without you as ocular and direct witness. Everywhere a volcano erupts, there will be one of our cameramen. Everywhere a tiger roars, our cameraman will be there. Our sound camera does not hesitate. It hunts the beauty queen when she is crowned. It gives you the greetings of the world champions boxer. In 1930, Emil Jannings was a film star, famous worldwide. He was believed to be the most paid European actor until that time for his performance in Der letzte Mann, Last Laugh. He earned success also in Hollywood, where he won the very first Oscar as Best Actor for the movies The Way of All Flesh by Victor Fleming and The Last Commander by von Sternberg. His power in the entertainment system was increasing, and his lifestyle resembled a contemporary pop star. Excesses, alcohol abuse, whims. When he came back to Germany after his first Hollywood movies, Jannings wanted to jump in the novelty of sound cinema. The transition to sound film confirmed his success also in the new language, thanks to the movie Der blaue Engel, The Blue Angel by von Sternberg. Jannings bought a house in Austria on the Lake Wolfgangsee when he was not busy in the cultural capital Berlin. He became so influential and powerful in the German studio system that he started to co-produce the movies in which he starred. The film he co-produced was exactly Liebing der Götter. The movie gained indeed a big acclaim by public, but had a bad reviews by critics. After the rise of Nazism, the Ministry of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, a fan of the actor, sent Jannings as a cultural representative in allied countries, among which Italy. Here, Benito Mussolini himself, a fan as well, expressively asked to be photographed together with him. The fondness expressed by Goebbels toward Jannings brought him to be inscribed in the list of actors protected by the propaganda ministry. The fact that Jannings did not distance himself from the Nazi regime, but on the contrary took advantage from the situation in order to increase his status, was the main reason for his decline. After 1945, the Allies forbade him to act for the rest of his life, and he died only 5 years after this prohibition. The two screenwriters Hans Müller and Robert Liebmann once stated that they wrote the script of Liebing der Götter, believing that a performer who suffered on the big screen so many times and so many times died deserved to be happy at least once. From his side, Jannings was eager to show his acting ability also in comedies and wanted to decide himself the subject for the screenplay of his first light role. He selected the Tokayer, the last play that he performed in the theater 6 years before, written by Hans Müller himself, who also wrote the script for the movie. It is the story of the acclaimed opera singer Albert Winkelmann, who devoted himself to his various female fans and had a life full of excesses without regrets. His wife, Agatha, tired of his continuous betrayals, decided to leave him right before his tournée in South America. But her words got lost among the voices of the fans rushed to say goodbye to their idol leaving. In Buenos Aires begins the nightmare of every opera singer. Winkelmann is not capable of mastering his voice, overcome by the revenge of his tired body. When he came back to his country, he had to decide how to react and how to manage his reputation, his emotional ties, his career. As I said, the movie was a success for the audience and confirmed that what Jannings wanted to demonstrate about his comic capacities. It was the incipit of the second half of his career, in which he joined production with a strong propaganda aim. There were other movies in which Jannings had a comedy role, as for instance Der zerbrochene Krug, one of his sound films with a great audience success, directed from Gustav Ucicki, and released in 1937. The contemporary critics sustained that Liebing der Götter was excessively focused on Jannings. The audience pleasure consisted mainly of the admiration of seeing him eating, drinking, and exaggerating, satisfying the elementary curiosity of peep somehow in the life of a famous person. At the same time, it was reproached to be anti-cosmopolitan, premonitory somehow of the nationalism soon to arrive. Winkelmann is constantly surrounded by strangers, mostly clever cheaters at any rate, dangerous if not even actually evil. Krakauer, for instance, was quite strict, while he criticized the movie to be gross and petit bourgeois and blamed Jannings of a mediocre performance. Goebbels, on the opposite, was enthusiastic, and through this film, so far from the sad atmospheres of the Blaue Engel, increased more and more his appreciation for Jannings. Abroad, especially in the US, the film had a wide audience and good success. The spectator easily recognized the importance of Emil Jannings for this film. His name appears 3 times on the opening credits. Emil Jannings in a movie produced by Emil Jannings, starring Emil Jannings. Contemporary critics and also his biographer Herbert Holba made fun of the fact that the best representation in the film was his personal menu, referring to the legend about Jannings' food requests during production. One of the reasons why apparently he did not stay longer in Hollywood was the fact that the food was not good enough for him, as demonstrated by the loss of 5 kilos during his stay in Hollywood. Liebing the Goethe was shot basically in front of the doors of Jannings' house at the Lake Wolfgangsee, following Jannings' rhythms, which were already considered in the process of screenwriting and in pre-production. Renate Müller, interpreting Jannings' wife, and the other characters played a very marginal role. They are almost caricatures. The only actor having more space is Hans Moser, but only because of his recognizable and peculiar voice, which could be better exploited thanks to sound cinema. The function of the other characters is just to give a certain sense of exotism to the audience. The main characteristic used to define the personalities is their accent. The use of different accents was indeed a novelty for the audience used to silent cinema. My personal opinion on Emil Jannings, which is of course not the main topic of this presentation, is very ambiguous. On one hand, I recognize his great actorial capabilities and performativity, as confirmed by the audience success and the international prizes won. On the other hand, I attribute him a certain difficulty of detaching himself from the character he had built around his star persona. I believe that the success of this film is to be attributed to his pervasive acting, as well as to certain lack of attention for the rhythm of the camera and for the loss of engagement in the dialogues. Emil Jannings is the personification of the so-called strongman, a masculine stereotype typical for his time. If this aspect made him somehow a caricature, considering this from our contemporary perspective, it is also true that other much more influential public figures performed an attitude, mimic, and spoken language much more excessive than the one used by Jannings. Jannings' acting style in the talkies is very much influenced by his experience within the silent film. The impression is that the scene and sequences shot for the sound version were used for the silent version as well without any distinction. In a movie constructed around Jannings and his star persona, the impression is that the direction is exercised neither by Hans Schwarz nor by Jannings, but by his acting. Why was made of this film a silent version despite it was already shot as talkie? The reasons are technical and, so to say, economic. It is often forgotten or simply not taken into account that even in the transition from silent to sound, a part of the audience could simply prefer the silent, disliking the sound. We mostly think that this sort of debate, particularly the philosophical and artistic issues and concern, could only be animated in the frame of the official critic, in a stark dichotomy between promoter versus detractors. Besides part of the intellectual establishment, such including Karl Fröhlich, a well-known German cameraman, true pioneer of sound, who considered this form as a recourse compared to the silent film, the mass of public was also involved in the opposition. A lot of people simply did prefer the silence. Yet the acceleration in the transition was encouraged by the economical politic and strategy of UFA, not really for artistic ambition. The technical reasons are multiple. The sound apparatus of the first equipped theaters was extremely complex, and not every projectionist was able to use it without a background in music field. The equipment consists of multiple single parts, eventually linked through a jungle of cables and controlled through bulky, heavy panels which required a lot of space. It just took one single error in the setting to lead to a misfunction. A standard system included a taker linked to the projector, a preamplifier, an equalizer, an amplifier, the speakers, and all respective control panels. The projectionist was supposed to be able to manage all of these instruments and coincidentally to detect during the reproduction the source of possible failures. He was required to understand if a rustle came from the print, from the recording, or from the reproduction, and it wasn't rare at all that he could fall in this evaluation, ruining inexorably the hearing and viewing experience of the whole film. Aside of all this, these systems were quite expensive, and not affordable at all for the average theater operator, who was therefore forced to find handmade solutions. The real problem was in fact the preamplifier, very hard to build on hand-made base. If not at its state of art, it tended to cut the high frequencies, turning the sound reproduction into inaudible. Lastly, the speakers were not readily assembled on wood platform which amplified the reverberation. The dialogues were the most afflicted of all this. It is indeed mostly believed that in the early 30s, the drama left place to the carnival of light opera as a consequence of the intention to distract the people from the unemployment and other issues soon to come. This is probably true, although certainly not the only reason. Comedies and light opera movies were already written with long singing scenes and musical sequences in order to leave apart complex dialogues, leaving words a smaller importance for the understanding of the plot. A muted version of the film could give the chance to make this whole thing easier. The film just needed a musical accompaniment with a few hits which appealed the public and some background noise sufficient to give appearance of likelihood, which anyway did not require great sound quality. It was easier to export if it's considered that the distributor or exporter only needed to replace the intertitle, way applicable in a case like Liebing the Goethe, starring an irrepressible Emil Jannings. Finally, it could be also exploited as traditional silent, especially in the province, where the theaters mostly still weren't equipped. A very important target for a film written without big artistic pretensions. As we started to work on this project, the two versions of the film were not our first topic. Actually, we even ignored at the time the existence of the silent version of Liebing the Goethe, and our main goal was in the frame of a digitization of a larger filmography of sound films with Emil Jannings, aside from the Bauer Engel, since most of them were basically underestimated after the historiography assimilated it to a certain regard to the Nazis. Aside from the Lamprecht's film encyclopedia, in which a silent version of the film was vaguely mentioned, each trace of it is hardly to find. We deduced that the silent version was barely lost. According to the database of the German Federal Film Archive, all preserved elements of this film related to the same version, which confirmed our first suspicions. Nevertheless, we found a copy of the censorship copy of this film in which it was clearly mentioned that it was about a sound version, although no other information about an alternative version was reported. This finding made change definitely our mind, and let us start compare all preserved elements until we found the right ones. It came immediately out that each of the two versions come from a different camera negative, while the soundtrack of the silent version appears to be a rearrangement of the one of the sound version, which were practically cutting away the dialogues and added a music background according to a different length of each shot and sequence. Peculiarly, comparing the two versions, it is even possible to find out which take of the same shot was taken at first, as you can see in the first clip. Please, per favore, clip numero 1. learnings at the time to finish his soup while he shot this scene. The two projects have to be considered as independent from the other one, or more precisely, the silent version is something like an extension of the restoration of the sound one. In fact, we're taking for the restoration of the silent version as reference for the grading and the sound correction, looking for a unity in both image and sound. In this frame, it is worth to consider that the original negative of the sound version is still existent and was used as source for the scan, while the negative of the silent one did not survive. For this version was used a dupe as source, which involves that the two starting elements were not of the same generation. That means that, despite the very good physical condition of our used elements, there was no way to overcome the loss of sharpness and the differences in the grain resulting from the analog reproduction. Furthermore, there was no reference for the grading, since there is no trace of preserved German vintage prints, wherefore we decided to base the reconstruction of the grading on empiric element. For instance, we analyzed other contemporary works of the same director of photography, Günther Ritrovato, who worked the same year on two other projects, Einbrecher, an entertainment comedy with Wilfried Fritsch, Lilian Arwen, and Hans Ruhmann, and Der Blaue Engel. Despite the differences in the genres of these three films, we noticed several solutions in common in the lighting of mid and full shots. We also assumed that, as well as for Einbrecher, the photography may have lived place to the sound the most as possible, especially in all around Emil Janning's film like Liebing der Götter. All these assumptions were supported by highly enlightened sequences which didn't leave any margin to different interpretation. Both versions have been scanned in 4K, the soundtrack has been digitally scanned via COSP. We didn't need any invasive correction in the digital restoration, seeing the very good condition of the starting elements. Comparing the images of the two versions, one can see that the film stock of both of them was developed in the same frame and in the same technical environment. Dark spots apparently connected to the same developed process with the same sharpness and intensity were regularly detected in both elements. We decided to keep them visible, following our internal guidelines according to the meanwhile most accredited standard for the digital restoration and preservation of the typical characteristic of the analog production and post-production processes. Accordingly to it, we overcame easily the ethical question of replace shots or scenes from a version through corresponding parts of better quality from the other element. We decided to keep the two versions, one from another strictly divided, even in cases where the lack of photographic detail was made evident by insert of later generation. The ethical question spreads out even more talking about the soundtrack, since the sound was taken at the very beginning of the sound recording for film, as the technique was way far from its state of art. We obviously decided not to intervene to possibly adjust technical defects, even if their intensity sometimes risks to be disturbing for the fruition and experience of a dialogue or similar. A very good example for it is a brief sequence in which a very strong sound distortion covers up the soundtrack. During the restoration at l'Immagine Ritrovata, Gilles Barberis, sound restorer, attributed this artifact to a weakness of the microphones to the humidity coming from the lake on the background during the live recording, an assumption that Incontri confirmed in the essays von Stummfilm zum Tonfilm von Corinna Müller for Wilhelm Film Verlag, a very precious source for the research topic of this presentation. In the final restoration, including today's screening, the soundtrack sounds the same as it was originally. Clip numero 2, per favore.
Hochwohlgeborene Herr Kammerchef, im Auftrage des gesamten technischen Personals der Staatsoper bin ich hier hierher gekommen. Ja, bin ich hierher gekommen, um Ihnen in dieser Schmuckentracht des Landes, ja, Herr Gott, noch einmal, um Ihnen in der Schmuckentracht dieses Landes zu Herr Gott, mein Gott, man versteht ja nicht einmal sein eigenes Wort. Ich bin halt von einer Nervosität nicht.
On the other hand, it is remarkable how, in the next example, the line of dialogue was simply muted according to the practice of sound mixing directly on set during the recording itself. Clip numero 3.
Lang genug hat's gedauert. Das spätestens mir nicht.
Aber so warten's doch. Ich will doch auch was sehen.
Ja, was willst du denn sehen? Oh, dreh's doch nicht so auf den nüchternen Magen. Ja, vergilt mich. Aber lass mich doch leben. Ihr wisst es ja eh schon.
Wie lange bleibt denn der Herr Kammersänger drüben, in Amerika?
Das weiß ich nicht. Da müssen Sie ihm schon selber fragen. Ja, vergilt mich. Sagt Sie mir, Kinder, habt ihr jetzt nichts Besseres zu tun? Ein Tenor ist doch auch nur ein Mensch. So ein Blödsinn. Ja, das ist auch nur in Wien möglich. Wann kommt denn der Herr Kammersänger in die Garderobe? Um 10 Uhr früh noch nicht. Da ist er noch bei der...
I won't reveal anything striking by saying that the silent and sound films speak two different languages. Nevertheless, the case of Liebing the Goethe deserves to be further explored because of different reasons. Most obviously because it offers us two versions of the same film, meaning it gives us a case to deepen how concretely the production and eventually the director related themselves to the different communicative approaches. Secondly, the silent version was obtained starting from the sound version, not the opposite as one could intuitively think. Moreover, it was shot at very rising of the talkies, combining the needs and intention of spectacularize the new innovation in the matter of synchronized reproduction of sound and image. Not the least, the fact that the leading role was held by Amy Jannings, who typically managed his talkies performance by taking very much from his experience of silent actors. Comparing the two versions, it's very strong the feeling that all shots were taken with no distinction if for the silent or the sound one. Although the rhythm is radically different, since the sound version has longer shots that assure Amy Jannings a right space and time to express his dialectic, his presence, and the presence of the sound of his voice. In the next example, the silent version renounced completely an entire gag, in which, among other things, is mentioned the Russian accent of the female role. Leaving aside the meaning of the gag, it is quite clear that in the intention of the production director, this could not work if not in a talkie. Clip numero 4.
Hör mal, Olguschka, ich finde deinen russischen Akzent wundervoll, aber wenn du schlecht von meiner Agathe sprichst, das schmeiß ich dich raus.
So.
Ja, das kann ich nicht leiden.
Also du liebst deine Agathe.
Natürlich liebe ich sie. Gott, ich mache manchmal einen kleinen Seitensprung, springe sogar sehr gerne. Weißt du, diese Gymnastik, die erhält mich beweglicher. Ich brauche das bei meinem Körpergewicht. Aber weg von meiner Agathe? Nee.
So.
Kommt nicht in Frage, wie man in meiner Vaterstadt Berlin so schön sagt.
Also du willst ein Ehekrüppel bleiben. Das verstehe ich nicht.
Ist das wirklich so schwer zu verstehen, dass man eine Frau betrügt, beschwindelt, quält, meinetwegen, und dass man trotzdem nicht ohne sie leben kann? Ganz einfach, weil sie das ist, worauf man sich verlassen kann. Weil sie eben die Frau ist.
Die Frau! Weil man mit einem Mann beim Standesbeamten war, deswegen ist man noch lange nicht seine Frau.
Herr Kammersänger, das wird die werte Frau Gemahlin sein.
Du bitte geh doch mal so lange da nebenan hinein, ja?
the dramatic asset of the sound version is way similar to a theatrical play, less dynamic than in the silent version, with no creative side in the coexistence of sound and image. The editing of the silent version, on the contrary, is faster and varied, with a larger use of close-ups despite of the manifold shots of the sound version. Following the same structures, also in the length of the intertitles is shorter and essential than the talked lines. In other words, the silent version is made silent by the editing. Clip numero 5.
Verehrte Hörerinnen und Hörer, nach einem Abend beispiellosen Triumphes, wie er nur einem wirklichen Liebling der Götter beschieden sein kann, besteigt Kammersänger Winkelmann soeben seinen Schlafwagen, um nach Triest und von dort nach Südamerika zu reisen. Kinoreporter und Pressefotografen umdrängen ihn, während er seinen berühmten Winkelmann-Hut Abschied schwenkt. Hören Sie nur, meine verehrten Hörerinnen und Hörer, wie begeistert die Menge ist. Die Schutzleute halten die Begeisterten mit Mühe von Winkelmanns Wagen weg. So, jetzt ist der Platz endlich abgesperrt. Ja, und jetzt reicht der berühmte Garderobier Winkelmanns, Herr Kratochwil, seinem Chef, das Handgepäck in den Schlafwagen hinauf.
Ich kann mich singen, da ist unser Glücksschuhandel und glückliche Reise.
In addition, I find worth to mention short cases in which pieces of dialogue remain stuck in the soundtrack of the silent version. These are all cases where a live music on set or the sound in background overlap the voices, preventing that these are muted. This can be seen as a result of the live recording on a single track without mixing in post-production. Nevertheless, there is at least a scene that would let think that the lines are intentionally being preserved also in the silent version because of their importance at the dramatic peak of the story, as if the exchange would have only worked if with sound. Ultima clip, la numero 6.
Einsteigen, die Herrschaften.
Mutschen. Mutschen.
Nein, Albert. Glückliche Reise und Hals- und Beinbruch für Amerika.
Aber Mama, Mama. Mama.
Ich bin ja so verliebt. Hallo.
In other cases, lastly, the talked word has no function, and it's barely sure that its presence is only due to the technical limit of removing it. Liebing der Götter is probably not exactly an artistic masterpiece, although the coexistence of the two versions of this film is for sure an important exhibit on an historical level for different reasons. It gives us the chance to observe how the UFA read the communicative approaches in the transition from silent to sound film and which strategy were undertaken in order to appeal a new audience. It provides us of concrete examples about how to the limit of the first sound system sounded like, as well in recording as in reproduction, and why despite of it a production company would have eventually invested in a double version of the same film. Each of both versions is actually to be considered as independent from the other one, which excludes automatically the possibility that a digital restoration would take the best from each of them. Liebing is a faithful representation of the status of Emil Jannings at the time, showing the life of a spoiled star in a way slave of its own fame. He was 66 as he died in 1950, only 5 years after he was banned by the elite because of his controversial attitude with the Nazi regime. He was diabetic and suffered under a liver cancer. Some say he paid his excesses. Liebing probably unconscious, anticipated some of the fears of each star. What would become of me if I lose my art? Hopefully this presentation attracted your attention to our digital restoration, which is going to be screened in about an hour, probably less, and that you consider this as a first episode waiting for the silent version soon to be finished. Thank you very much. See?
No, it's more curiosity because when you screen the overscan of the silent version of the film, I didn't get where the sound came from on the film because there was no soundtrack, right?
Right, it was on a separate support. As usual, this is not the only case. Yeah, it was simply recorded from, or dubbed from a negative, which meanwhile is gone lost.
Ah, okay, so it was just synchronized for the scanning.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.